My father screamed that I betrayed our family for bees, but they made me a millionaire. The moment my name echoed through the conference hall speakers, I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Ethan Gardner, Investment Analyst of the Year. My colleagues erupted in applause, their faces beaming with that manufactured corporate enthusiasm we've all perfected. My footsteps toward the stage felt mechanical, like I was watching myself from somewhere else. This was supposed to be the highlight of my career at 30. The golden ticket that proved I hadn't wasted the last 8 years of my life crunching numbers and sacrificing weekends. But standing there, crystal award in hand, all I could think about was my grandfather's voice. Sometimes the biggest cage is the one we build ourselves, Ethan. He'd told me that the last time I visited him in Vermont, 3 months before cancer took him. I nodded and smiled at faces I barely knew outside of Zoom calls and elevator small talk, wondering when exactly I'd built these bars around myself. The company had rented out the top floor of Boston's most expensive hotel for the ceremony. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city skyline, all those twinkling lights representing lives I knew nothing about, lives that might actually matter to the people living them. My boss, Richard, clapped me on the shoulder as I stepped off stage, that same painful grip he used whenever he wanted to remind everyone who was really in charge. "Speech," he prompted, eyebrows raised. I mumbled something about teamwork and opportunities and innovation, all those empty corporate buzzwords that mean everything and nothing. The crowd seemed satisfied. They could go back to their drinks and networking now that the formalities were dealt with. My phone buzzed in my pocket, just as I was contemplating how early I could slip out without seeming ungrateful. A notification from my home security system. Probably just Megan getting back from her girls' night that had been happening suspiciously often lately. But there was also an email notification from my grandfather's lawyer. Something about final documents requiring attention. I escaped to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and opened the email. The lawyer had finally sent the detailed inheritance letter my grandfather had prepared before his death. I already knew about the Victorian house and the bee farm in Vermont that had been covered in the will reading last month. But this letter was different. Personal. "Ethan, by now you know I've left you the house and the bees," my grandfather had written. "What you don't know is why. These past 10 years tending to the colony have been the only honest years of my life. Before that, I was just like you, chasing someone else's definition of success. I'm leaving you this legacy not as a burden, but as an escape hatch. I've watched you become increasingly hollow each time you visit. Remember when you used to catch fireflies in that meadow? That kid knew more about living than the man I saw at Christmas. I hope you'll continue what I started, not just with the bees, but with living deliberately. The colony doesn't need you, Ethan, but I think you might need them." I read it 3 times, my throat tightening. The bathroom's harsh fluorescent lights suddenly seemed even more artificial. I tucked my phone away and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection. When had those lines appeared around my eyes? When had my smile started looking so practiced? I rejoined the party long enough to shake the right hands before making my excuses. The night was still young by corporate standards, barely 9 p.m., but I couldn't stomach another minute of pretending this mattered to me. The Uber ride home was quiet, the driver picking up on my mood and mercifully avoiding small talk. Rain started spattering against the windows as we pulled onto my street in Back Bay, an appropriately gloomy backdrop for my thoughts. The security system notification from earlier came back to mind as I noticed an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked across from our townhouse. Something felt off. Megan's girls' nights didn't usually involve bringing people back to our place. I should have made more noise coming in. I should have texted that I was heading home early. I should have done anything except what I did. Quietly unlocked the door and walked directly into scene of my fiancée tangled up on our couch with Brad Jenkins, my business partner of 5 years. They scrambled apart like teenagers caught by parents, but the damage was done. Brad's expensive tie was draped over my favorite reading lamp. Megan's girls' night outfit was scattered across our living room floor. The betrayal was so cliché it was almost laughable. "How long?" was all I could manage. Brad started stammering about mistakes and meaningless attraction, but Megan just looked at me with something between guilt and relief. 6 months, she admitted. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of strategy meetings where Brad had looked me in the eye while knowing he was going home to text my fiancée. I suddenly understood why our investment approaches had become so synchronized lately. They weren't just discussing market trends during those late-night emergency client calls. At least now I know why our investment strategies have been so aligned. I said, the bitter irony tasting like copper in my mouth. Congratulations on the exceptional teamwork. Richard would be proud. I didn't shout. I didn't break things. I just went upstairs, packed a suitcase with the cold efficiency that had made me so valuable to the firm, and called another Uber. Megan followed me, alternating between apologies and justifications about how I was always working and emotionally unavailable. Brad wisely stayed downstairs, probably calculating professional fallout already. Keep the ring, I told her as I zipped in my bag. It matches your moral compass. Expensive but fundamentally flawed. I spent that night in a hotel, staring at the ceiling and feeling strangely detached from the hurricane of betrayal. By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I called my parents and asked them to meet for brunch, knowing Sunday was the only day my father, a high-powered corporate attorney, allowed himself to be unreachable by clients. The meeting went about as well as expected. My mother, always a diplomat, expressed appropriate sympathy about Megan while already mentally reorganizing the wedding cancellation logistics. My father, however, took my breakup as a minor speed bump. Take 2 weeks. Clear your head, then get back in the game, he advised between bites of his overpriced omelet. Jenkins was always a snake. We'll make sure it's professionally radioactive by quarter's end. Then I dropped the real bombshell. I'm quitting the firm. I'm moving to Vermont to take over Grandpa's bee farm. The silence that followed was spectacular. My father's fork actually froze midway to his mouth. You want to throw away an Ivy League education and a 6-figure salary to play with insects? He wasn't asking so much as confirming he hadn't hallucinated my statement. It's not just about the bees, I tried explaining. It's about building something that matters. To me, at least. My father's laugh was short and sharp. This is your response to getting cheated on? Trading Wall Street for bugs? That's not a life plan. Ethan, that's a quarter-life crisis. My mother attempted mediation. Maybe a short sabbatical would. I've already decided, I interrupted, with more conviction than I'd felt about anything in years. Grandpa left me that property because he knew I was drowning here. Your grandfather was a brilliant man who threw away a promising career to play farmer. My father snapped. Don't romanticize his choices just because he left you some rustic fixer-upper and a hobby. I paid the check despite their protests and left them sitting there. My father already called my boss to damage control what he saw as a temporary insanity. 3 days later, I found myself in my apartment surrounded by boxes, my resignation letter sent, my replacement at the firm already eager to take my clients. Megan had moved most of her things out while I was at the office clearing my desk. The efficiency of our separation was perhaps the most telling commentary on our relationship. That night, alone in my half-empty apartment, I pulled out my grandfather's leather-bound journal that had been included with the inheritance letter. He documented 10 years of beekeeping adventures, successes, and failures. His handwriting grew shakier toward the end, but his observations became sharper, more philosophical. I thumbed through the pages, absorbing his notes about honey production and weather patterns, until I reached an entry from about 2 years ago that caught my eye. Discovered something extraordinary today. The bees that primarily fed on the wild meadow beyond the north property line have produced a honey unlike any I've tasted before. There's something in those wildflowers, perhaps that rare mountain herb Dr. Erickson mentioned. I've set aside this batch and labeled it Elixir of Kings. Not for selling. This one heals more than the body, with the right preparation and the addition of specific herbs from the eastern slope. This honey seems to restore something essential in the spirit. The process requires patience and precise timing with the moon cycles. The entry continued on to the next page, but to my frustration, that page had been torn out. The journal continued afterward with mundane observations about hive maintenance, with no further mention of this special honey. I checked the envelope again, but there was no missing page. Whatever this elixir of kings was, my grandfather had either taken the secret to his grave or hidden it somewhere in that old Victorian house in Vermont. I closed the journal, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine curiosity. Not the calculated interest I forced myself to show clients, but an actual hunger to discover something unknown. As I looked around to strip down remnants of my Boston life, I realized my grandfather had left me more than property. He'd left me a mystery. And for the first time since that empty moment on the award stage, I felt something real stirring inside me. Anticipation. The drive to Vermont took longer than the GPS promised. Each mile north seemed to peel away another layer of my former life, like shedding an old skin I hadn't realized was suffocating me. By the time I crossed the state line, my phone had stopped buzzing with concerned texts from colleagues and awkward apologies from Brad. Either they'd given up or I'd finally hit a dead zone. Both possibilities felt like freedom. April in Vermont wasn't the postcard spring I'd imagined. The trees were still mostly bare, and patches of stubborn snow clung to the shadowy places between hills. The narrow country roads twisted through valleys that hadn't quite shaken off winter's grip. When I finally turned onto the gravel driveway that led to my grandfather's, my property, reality hit harder than expected. The Victorian house stood like an aging aristocrat fallen on hard times, dignified in structure but clearly neglected. Paint peeled from the ornate trim. Several shutters hung at awkward angles, and the wraparound porch sagged noticeably on one side. I'd visited my grandfather here many times, but always during summer holidays when the overgrown garden seemed charming rather than wild, and temporary roof patches weren't tested by melting snow. The beehives scattered across the backfield looked even worse. From the dozen or so hives my grandfather had proudly maintained during my childhood visits, only 4 remained standing. The others had collapsed into sad piles of weathered wood. Even to my untrained eye, the surviving hives appeared abandoned. No activity around their entrances despite the afternoon sun breaking through clouds. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes, engine off, just staring at my inheritance. This wasn't the romantic fresh start I'd impulsively embraced in Boston. This was a money pit with wings. The sensible part of my brain, the part shaped by 8 years of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis, screamed to turn around and beg for my job back. Losing everything is the best way to understand what actually matters, I muttered to myself, repeating one of my grandfather's favorite sayings. With that mantra echoing in my head, I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped into my new life. The house smelled exactly as I remembered, a mixture of old wood, honey, and that peculiar scent that belonged only to my grandfather, something like pipe tobacco and mint tea. The lawyer had mentioned that a cleaning service had come through after the funeral, but the place still felt frozen in time. His reading glasses sat on the kitchen table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. His ancient flannel jacket hung by the door, as if he might walk in any minute to grab it before checking on his bees. I didn't have much time to get sentimental. Within an hour of arrival, dark clouds rolled in, bringing the kind of spring storm that makes you question all your life choices. The roof, what had looked questionable from the outside, proved definitively unreliable from the inside. I spent my first night as a Vermont property owner positioning buckets under leaks and watching my ceiling develop ominous water stains in real time. Sleep came in patches between thunderclaps and the discovery of new leaks. By morning, I was exhausted, damp, and seriously questioning my sanity. The storm had passed, but my mood hadn't improved. A quick inspection revealed that the power was out, the ancient furnace had given up entirely, and my phone had exactly 1 bar of service, enough to receive messages but not reliably send them. I needed coffee, warmth, and possibly an exorcist for whatever had possessed me to think this was a good idea. The town of Millfield was only 5 miles away, according to my grandfather's faded local map. I changed into the only dry clothes I had left and headed out in search of civilization. Millfield turned out to be exactly the kind of small Vermont town featured in holiday movies. A single main street lined with brick buildings, a white church steeple dominating one end, and a town square with gazebo at the other. On a normal day, it might have been charming. In my current state, unshaven, undercaffeinated, and slightly damp, It felt like walking onto a stage where everyone but me knew the script. The locals noticed me immediately. That peculiar small-town radar for outsiders was apparently functioning perfectly. Several people nodded politely before quickly averting their eyes, which I later learned was a New England equivalent of staring openly. I caught snippets of whispered conversations that stopped when I got too close. Gardner, beekeeper's grandson, city boy. The news of my arrival had clearly preceded me. I ducked into the most promising building, a storefront with both books and coffee advertised in hand-painted letters on the window. The bell above the door announced my entrance with unnecessary enthusiasm, drawing the attention of the handful of customers scattered among mismatched tables and overstuffed chairs. "You must be Ethan Gardner." The woman behind the counter didn't phrase it as a question. She was about my age, maybe a year or two younger, with dark hair pulled back into a practical ponytail, and the kind of smile that suggested she found something mildly amusing about my existence. Her green apron had bookmark and brew embroidered across the front, along with a small illustration of a coffee cup balanced on an open book. "News travels fast," I replied, suddenly aware of how disheveled I must look. Small towns run on gossip and coffee, in that order. She pushed a steaming mug across the counter before I'd even ordered. "Black, right? Your grandfather always said complicated coffee was for people with uncomplicated problems." That startled a laugh out of me. It sounded exactly like something he would say. "You knew him well?" "My dad was his beekeeping buddy for 20 years. I'm Lucy Bishop." She wiped her hands on her apron before extending one. Her handshake was firm and brief, businesslike rather than friendly. "Sorry about your roof." I nearly choked on my first sip. "How did you—" "Mrs. Abernathy lives on the hill behind your property. She called this morning to report what she described as, and I quote, 'that poor Gardner boy running around with buckets like a headless chicken during the storm.'" Lucy's expression softened slightly. "The whole town's been taking bets on how long you'll last. Current odds aren't in your favor. In Boston, this level of honesty would have been offensive. Here, oddly, it felt refreshing. At least she wasn't pretending to be impressed by my corporate credentials or feigning interest in my investment strategies." "And what did you bet?" I asked, finding myself genuinely curious. "I don't gamble." She refilled my mug without asking. "But if I did, I'd say your grandfather wouldn't have left you that place if he didn't think you had it in you. He wasn't a man who made decisions lightly. It was the only genuinely welcoming thing anyone had said to me since I'd arrived. Not sympathy or curiosity, but a vote of confidence based on my grandfather's judgment rather than my own obvious unsuitability for rural life. "Your dad was a beekeeper too?" I asked, changing the subject before I embarrassed myself by showing too much gratitude for this small kindness. "Still is. Bennett Bishop Apiaries, 3 miles east." Pride crept into her voice. "Best honey in the county, despite what your grandfather always claimed." We talked for another half hour, through 2 more coffee refills. Lucy turned out to be a practical encyclopedia of local knowledge, from which hardware store wouldn't overcharge me for roof patching supplies to which the local handyman could actually be trusted to show up when promised. She didn't offer sympathy for my clearly desperate situation. Instead, she offered solutions. "Your grandfather always said strong hands matter more than pretty words," she remarked as I was leaving, loaded down with supplies from the hardware store next door, plus a bag of fresh scones she'd insisted I take. "If you're serious about staying, I can show you the basics of hive maintenance. What's left of your colonies won't survive without intervention." I accepted her offer with more gratitude than dignity. 2 days later, she arrived at my still leaking but somewhat improved house in a battered pickup truck, wearing what I would come to recognize as the unofficial uniform of serious beekeepers. Faded jeans, long-sleeved shirt, an air of calm competence that made my Harvard MBA seem increasingly irrelevant. My first attempt at beekeeping should probably be classified as a war crime against insects. Lucy brought a spare protective suit, which I somehow managed to put on backward initially. The veil kept collapsing against my face. The gloves felt like oven mitts, and I moved with all the grace of a tranquilized rhinoceros. "They can sense fear," Lucy warned as she effortlessly lifted a frame teeming with bees from one of the surviving hives. They're like Winchester bankers. They only attack when they think you're weak. I wasn't sure if I should be impressed that she knew where I'd worked or offended by the comparison. Before I could decide, a Singleby decided to investigate my veil up close. What followed was not my proudest moment. My embarrassing dance of panic included arms windmilling, feet tangling, and a spectacular backwards fall into a muddy patch that had once been my grandfather's herb garden. From my position on the ground, I could see several local farmers who'd been working in the adjacent field stop to watch the entertainment. Their laughter carried clearly across the spring air. Lucy, to her credit, didn't laugh, at least not visibly. She calmly finished her inspection, closed up the hive, and then offered me a hand up from my muddy seat. Well, now that you've given the entire county their best store of the week, want to try again without the interpretive dance? Her matter-of-fact attitude somehow made it possible for me to brush off both the mud and the embarrassment. By the end of the afternoon, I'd successfully held a frame without dropping it, identified the queen in one hive, and learned that only 2 of my 4 remaining hives actually contained bee colonies. The others were empty, abandoned for reasons Lucy couldn't determine without more investigation. Your grandfather was worried about colony collapse last summer, she mentioned as we packed up the equipment. He was trying something experimental with that wild meadow on the north property line. My ears perked up, remembering the journal entry about the elixir of king's honey. What kind of experiment? Lucy shrugged. He kept that close to the chest. Dad was annoyed about it, actually. They usually shared all their beekeeping tricks. The mystery deepened. But before I could press further, reality intruded in the form of a sudden snowstorm. April in Vermont, I was quickly learning, was less about spring flowers and more about Mother Nature's mood swings. This storm made my first night's leaky ceiling adventure seem like a minor inconvenience. The temperature plummeted, wind howled through every crack in the Victorian's ancient frame, and the wet, heavy snow proved too much for the already damaged roof. Around midnight, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, a section of the back porch roof collapsed entirely, taking down the kitchen ceiling with it. I spent the night huddled in the living room with every blanket I could find, watching my breath cloud in the frigid air, and seriously reconsidering all my life choices. By morning, the storm had cleared, revealing both a pristinely white landscape and the full extent of the damage. My meager food supplies were buried under roofing debris and ceiling plaster. The kitchen was now effectively outdoors. Numb with cold and defeat, I checked my phone, hoping to at least call a contractor. That's when I saw the email notification from First National Bank of Vermont, sent the previous evening before the power went out again. The message was polite but devastating. My grandfather, it seemed, had taken out a substantial loan against the property 2 years ago, right around the time of his mysterious honey experiment. With his death, the loan had come due. I had 90 days to pay off the remaining $157,000, or the bank would foreclose. I sat on the edge of my grandfather's ancient armchair, the only piece of furniture untouched by water damage, and laughed until my sides hurt. The cosmic joke was perfect. I'd walked away from a 6-figure salary to inherit a collapsing house, failing bee colonies and a massive debt. The worst part? Despite everything, some stubborn part of me still didn't want to give up and go back to Boston. The bank's email felt like a countdown timer, had started on my new life before it had even begun. $157,000 might as well have been $1 million given my current situation. I had some savings, but nowhere near enough. Most of my money had been tied up in the Boston condo Megan, and I had bought together, a place I now had zero interest in fighting for. Lucy found me the next morning sitting on my partially collapsed porch, staring blankly at the snow-covered beehives like they might spontaneously transform into ATMs. She took one look at my face and set down the coffee and breakfast sandwich she brought without asking questions. Bank called in Grandpa's loan. I finally explained after finishing half the sandwich. 90 days to come up with a small fortune, or this place goes to auction. Lucy's expression shifted from sympathy to something more calculating. There might be something you should know, she said after a long pause. My dad mentioned it last night when I told him about helping you with the hives. She explained that my grandfather hadn't just been any beekeeper. In beekeeping circles, which I hadn't realized were a thing until that moment, Arthur Gardner had been something of a rogue scientist. For decades, he'd been selectively breeding a specialized strain of honeybees, ones hardier against Vermont's harsh winters and more resistant to the diseases decimating bee populations nationwide. But they were notoriously difficult to maintain. Dad was actually his apprentice years ago, before they had their falling out. Lucy added, "Falling out? Over what?" This was news to me. Lucy shrugged. Dad never gave me details. Just said your grandfather became obsessed with some new breeding technique that Dad thought was too experimental, too risky, but he always respected his results. A memory clicked into place. My grandfather's mysterious journal entry about the elixir of king's honey from bees feeding on the wild meadow. Could these special bees be connected? Lucy's next suggestion sent us trudging through melting snow to the furthest corner of the property, a spot I hadn't explored during my initial assessment. There, nearly hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes, stood a single hive of unusual design. Unlike the standard white box hives, this one was built into a hollowed section of tree trunk, with intricate copper tubing running along one side and a glass viewing panel embedded in another. Dad mentioned this, Lucy said, running her fingers along the weathered wood. Your grandfather's pet project. Everyone thought these colonies would die first without him tending them, but... She gestured toward the narrow entrance where, despite the lingering chill, bees were actively coming and going. Sometimes the strongest creatures are the ones you least expect. Lucy smiled, her expression softening as she watched the industrious insects. The discovery felt like finding a heartbeat in a body presumed dead. One functioning colony wouldn't save me from foreclosure, but it represented something more important. My grandfather's legacy might still be salvageable. We spent the next week carefully documenting everything about the special hive. Lucy brought her father's old beekeeping journals, which contained scattered references to my grandfather's experimental techniques. Between those notes and my grandfather's partially ruined journal, we pieced together fragments of his unique honey production method. My kitchen, or what remained of it after moving operations to the less damaged dining room, transformed into something between a laboratory and a wizard's workshop. Mason jars lined every surface, labeled with different combinations of extraction techniques and processing temperatures. I borrowed equipment from Lucy's father, who remained skeptical but curious enough to contribute specialized honey extractors and filters. Our first attempt at recreating my grandfather's recipe was nothing short of catastrophic. The extraction process seemed simple enough on paper, but the reality involved sticky surfaces everywhere and a final product that looked more like motor oil than honey. Maybe we should taste it anyway? I suggested, eyeing the dubious substance. Lucy, braver than I deserved, dipped a finger in and immediately regretted her decision. Her face contorted into what might be the most impressive display of politeness battling disgust I'd ever witnessed. When I tried it, there was no such internal conflict. I spat it out immediately, much to Lucy's amusement. "I'm guessing your grandfather left out some crucial ingredients," she laughed, helping me clean up the mess. "Or maybe you're just a terrible cook." We tried 5 more variations over the next few days, each slightly less revolting than the last, but none producing anything close to the healing properties my grandfather had described. We were missing something fundamental. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, as they often do. I had taken to sitting near the special hive in the early mornings, partly to observe the bees' behavior, and partly because it was the one spot on the property that gave me a sense of connection to my grandfather. On the 3rd morning, I noticed something I'd overlooked. The returning bees weren't coming from nearby fields where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. They were consistently flying in from the dense forest that bordered the northern edge of the property. "We need to follow them," I told Lucy when she arrived with our now ritual morning coffee. She looked at me like I'd suggested skydiving without a parachute. Follow thousands of flying insects through dense woodland? Are you having a city boy mental breakdown? But curiosity eventually won out. We spent most of that day tracking bee flight patterns, noting the direction most worker bees took when leaving the hive. By mid-afternoon, we had a rough bearing toward a section of forest about a half-mile from the property line. The hike wasn't technical, but it wasn't exactly a nature walk either. What started as a manageable forest path quickly devolved into tangled underbrush and increasingly steep terrain. Lucy, naturally, navigated like someone born in hiking boots, while I provided entertainment with my frequent stumbles and increasingly creative curses. Just when I was about to suggest turning back, the forest opened into a small clearing nestled between two rocky outcroppings. The sight stopped us both in our tracks. The meadow was carpeted with wild flowers I didn't recognize, delicate blossoms in shades of purple and blue, with silvery green foliage that seemed to shimmer in the dappled light. And everywhere, bees, dozens of them, moving methodically from flower to flower. Holy! Lucy breathed, her eyes wide. These are alpine moon lilies. They're not supposed to grow in Vermont. They're endangered even in their native Appalachian habitats. Her voice held the reverence of someone who had just discovered buried treasure. My grandfather's journal suddenly made sense. The mountain herbs he'd mentioned weren't something he added to the honey. They were what the bees were harvesting. This isolated microclimate, protected by the rock formations and fed by an underground spring we discovered at the meadow's edge, had created the perfect environment for plants that shouldn't have been able to survive here. We collected small samples of the plants, carefully noting their locations and characteristics. Back at the house, Lucy identified several other rare botanical specimens mixed among the moon lilies, each with documented medicinal properties in traditional herbalism. Your grandfather wasn't just making honey, Lucy explained, excitement making her words tumble out faster than usual. He was essentially creating a natural pharmacy. These plants have compounds used in everything from anti-inflammatories to mood stabilizers. With this new understanding, our next batch of honey took a different approach. Rather than trying to process or modify the raw honey from the special hive, we simply filtered it carefully, preserving as much of the natural properties as possible. The result was stunning. A honey with an amber hue that seemed to capture the sunlight itself, and a complex flavor profile that started sweet but unfolded into something herbal and almost pine-like. The first taste made both of us go silent. It wasn't just good, it was transformative. The flavor seemed to evolve on the tongue, revealing new dimensions with each moment. More surprisingly, I felt an immediate sense of clarity and warmth spreading through my body. "This is it," I whispered, almost afraid to break the moment. This is what he was making. We produced only 3 small jars from that first successful batch, barely enough to consider legitimate production, but enough to confirm we'd rediscovered my grandfather's secret. The question remained, could the specialty honey somehow save the property from foreclosure? With barely 2 months remaining on the bank's deadline, we needed to move quickly. Lucy suggested starting small but strategic. Her bookstore/cafe had a corner dedicated to local artisanal products, honey, maple syrup, handcrafted items made by area residents. She offered to feature our honey there, albeit with a premium price tag that reflected its rarity. Mountain Elixir, we called it after much debate. The label design was minimalist, a simple sketch of the alpine moon lily and the silhouette of the Victorian house. I wanted to include claims about the honey's special properties, but Lucy wisely counseled restraint. "Let people discover the effects themselves," she advised. "Word of mouth is more powerful than anything we could print on a label." The first jar sold within hours. The second disappeared by the end of the day. The third went to an elderly woman who had been a friend of my grandfather's. She returned 2 days later, moving more easily than before, to ask if we had more. Word spread through Millfield with a speed only possible in small towns where news is currency. By the end of the week, we had a waiting list of locals eager to try this miraculous honey from the Gardner place. The problem was supply. Even if we harvested everything the special hive produced, we couldn't meet the growing demand. Then came the email that changed everything. Lucy's Cafe occasionally attracted tourists passing through on their way to better-known Vermont destinations. One such visitor had been James Westerly, executive chef of a Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City. He'd purchased a jar of Mountain Elixir on a whim during his brief stop. His message was effusive, bordering on poetic. He described our honey as a revelation in flavor development and the missing element for a spring-tasting menu. He was developing focus on forgotten American ingredients. He wanted to feature it prominently and was prepared to pay handsomely for exclusive rights to our first commercial batch. The offer he outlined would cover nearly a third of the bank loan. Not enough to save us completely, but enough to buy precious time and fund expanding production. Lucy and I spent a frantic weekend harvesting honey. Identify which of the remaining standard hives could potentially be converted to house more of the special bee strain, and calculating exactly how much product we could realistically promise. When Chef Wesley suggested visiting personally to tour our operation, panic set in. Our operation was still essentially a hobbyist setup, with equipment borrowed from Lucy's reluctant father and processing happening in my semi-functional kitchen. But we couldn't turn down the opportunity. We had exactly 3 days to transform the bee farm into something resembling a legitimate business. Lucy's father, intrigued despite his ongoing skepticism, contributed additional equipment. Several locals, either out of respect for my grandfather or simple curiosity about the enterprise generating so much buzz, pun painfully intended, volunteered to help clean up the grounds and repair the most visible damage to the house. By the time the day of Wesley's visit arrived, we had managed to create a presentable workspace and a modest but professional-looking production area. The chef himself turned out to be refreshingly unpretentious, a barrel-chested man with a booming laugh who seemed genuinely fascinated by beekeeping and spent hours asking detailed questions about our methods. He left with our entire available supply, 12 precious jars, and a contract for future deliveries that would keep us afloat through summer. As his sleek rental car disappeared down the driveway, Lucy and I collapsed on the porch steps in exhausted disbelief. We might actually pull this off, I said, the reality still not quite sinking in. 1 down, 2/3 of a bank loan to go, Lucy replied, but her smile took any sting from the reminder. The next morning brought another vehicle up the long driveway, this one far more expensive than Chef Westerly's rental. The gleaming black Mercedes sedan looked utterly out of place against the backdrop of my weathered Victorian and budding apiaries. My stomach dropped as soon as I recognized it. The car doors opened in perfect synchronicity. From the driver's side emerged Brad, looking every inch a successful investment banker in a casual outfit that probably cost more than all my remaining worldly possessions combined. From the passenger side stepped Megan, her blown-out blonde hair and designer sunglasses a jarring reminder of the life I'd left behind. Lucy had just arrived with coffee and pastries, our morning ritual now firmly established. I felt her tense beside me as the Boston interlopers approached, her normally open expression closing into something carefully neutral. "Ethan, look at you, so rustic." Megan's voice carried across the yard, that familiar condescending warmth that I once mistook for affection. Brad hung back slightly, performing the awkward dance of man unsure how to greet someone whose fiancé and business partnership he'd simultaneously stolen. "Place has character," he offered lamely, eyes darting around the property without quite meeting mine. "What brings you to Vermont?" I asked, making no move to close the distance between us. "Seems like a long drive for someone else's scenery." Megan's smile never wavered, but her eyes narrowed slightly at my tone. "We heard about your little honey venture. The restaurant world is surprisingly small, darling. James Westerly and Brad's brother were roommates at Cornell." She glanced at Lucy, giving her the quick assessment I'd seen her apply to potential rivals at corporate events. "When we heard you'd somehow managed to interest a Michelin-starred chef in bee products, we thought perhaps you'd discovered a genuine opportunity." Brad finally found his business voice. "What Megan means is that we're interested in discussing investment opportunities, early funding, marketing strategy, distribution channels, all the things you'll need to scale properly." He gestured toward the humble setup behind me. "This is charming, but you'll need serious capital to meet commercial demand." Lucy's hand found mine, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by our visitors. Megan's perfect smile flickered for just a moment. "Come for your share, have you?" I asked, feeling Lucy's silent support beside me. The silence stretched between us like taffy, sweet with tension. Megan and Brad stood there in their designer clothes and manufactured confidence, waiting for me to jump at their offer like a desperate man. 2 months ago, I might have. 2 months ago, I was still defining success by their standards. "I appreciate the offer," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. but I'm not looking for investors right now." Brad actually laughed, that condescending chuckle he used with clients who didn't understand market realities. "Ethan, buddy, you're living in a half-collapsed house with a bank loan hanging over your head. You've stumbled onto something potentially valuable, but you can't seriously think you can scale this operation alone." I felt Lucy's hand squeeze mine slightly. The gesture said more than words could. "I'm not alone," I replied, surprised at myself at how steady my voice sounded. "And I'm not interested in scaling for the sake of scaling. What we're making here is special precisely because it's small batch, authentic, and tied to the specific place. Megan's perfect mask slipped just a fraction. This place is literally falling apart," she pointed out, gesturing to the still visible roof damage. "And let's be realistic. You've been a beekeeper for what, a month? This is a cute hobby, but without proper business infrastructure, you'll flame out before summer." "Maybe," I conceded, "but it'll be my flame out, not a corporate acquisition that strips everything authentic from my grandfather's legacy." They left 20 minutes later, after making increasingly less attractive offers and increasingly more dire predictions about my future. Brad's parting shot about knowing where to find me when reality sets in bounced off me like a bee against a window. I was done living by their definitions of success and failure. As their luxury sedan disappeared down the rutted driveway, Lucy let out a low whistle. "Well, that was something. You just turned down Armani and Prada for coveralls and me. Either you're crazy or incredibly brave." "Probably a bit of both," I admitted, surprised at myself with a laugh. But it felt good. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Chef Wesley's spring tasting menu featuring our Mountain Elixir honey launched to rave reviews, creating a buzz, can't help the pun, that extended far beyond what we could have hoped for. Food critics described the honey as revelatory and transformative, with one particularly enthusiastic reviewer claiming it had healing properties beyond mere flavor. That last bit worried me slightly. We were careful not to make health claims about the product, but the attention brought customers flocking to Westerly's restaurant specifically to try the honey-infused dishes. When his supply ran low, he contacted us in a near panic, offering to double his original price for an emergency delivery. Our production was still limited by the number of specialty colonies we had, but Lucy's father had finally come around and was helping us split the original colony to create new hives. The process was slow and unpredictable, but by early May, we had 3 functioning special hives instead of just 1. The real game changer came when Chef Wesley introduced me to Catherine Whitmore, an editor at Food and Wine magazine who happened to be dining at his restaurant. She was immediately intrigued by both the honey and my backstory. 2 days later, she was sitting on my still wobbly porch, recording our conversation for what would become a feature article titled "The Banker Who Became a Beekeeper, a Honey Revolution in the Vermont Mountains." The article painted me as some kind of corporate refugee who had found enlightenment through beekeeping, an oversimplification that made Lucy laugh out loud when she read it. But it captured enough truth about the special qualities of our honey to generate interest from specialty food stores and high-end restaurants across New England. Orders started flowing in faster than we could fill them. Lucy's father grudgingly admitted that the Gardner boy might be onto something and offer more substantial help with expanding our operation. We converted part of the barn into a proper honey extraction facility, invested in professional-grade equipment, and hired 2 local college students as part-time help. The loan deadline still loomed, but with our new income stream and a carefully structured payment plan negotiated with the bank, turns out my financial background was good for something. We secured a 6-month extension. For the first time since arriving in Vermont, I felt like I could breathe. The morning of our largest harvest yet, Lucy and I headed out at dawn to the special meadow. We'd been carefully monitoring the rare plants, taking only what we needed for bees and ensuring sustainable growth. The morning mist still clung to the valley as we made our way up the now familiar path, carrying empty collection baskets for additional herb samples. As the sun crested the eastern hills, it caught the dew-covered meadow at just the right angle. The entire clearing seemed to explode in golden light, thousands of pollen particles dancing in the air around us like microscopic stars. Lucy's face, illuminated in this magical glow, looked almost otherworldly. "This moment," she said softly, "is just like our honey. Rare, beautiful, and completely unexpected. In that perfect golden light, with bees humming contentedly around us and the scent of wild mountain herbs filling the air, I kissed her. Later, we joked that it was inevitable, that my grandfather had engineered the whole thing from beyond, creating the perfect circumstances for us to find each other. But in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Our first major public sales event at the Millfield Farmers Market nearly ended in disaster. We had prepared 100 jars, our largest batch yet, expecting them to sell steadily throughout the day. Instead, word had spread so effectively that a line formed before we even finished setting up our booth. By mid-morning, the crowd had grown so large it was blocking traffic through the market. Sheriff Jenkins, a man who defined the term no-nonsense, made his way through the throng with a look of suspicious determination on his face. "Got reports of a disturbance," he announced, eyeing our dwindling stock and the eager customers. "People claiming you're selling something that's causing unusual behavior." Lucy and I exchanged panicked glances. We'd been careful not to make health claims, but customers had been reporting everything from improved sleep to reduced joint pain. "Just honey, Sheriff," I explained, holding out a sample spoon. "Locally produced wildflower honey." He gave me the quintessential small-town lawman squint, then accepted the sample with obvious reluctance. The moment the honey touched his tongue, his expression shifted from suspicion to surprise. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, then louder. "Consider this your official permission to cause addiction. Might need a jar myself. For evidence purposes, of course." That moment of levity became a turning point. Sheriff Jenkins' unofficial endorsement eliminated the last traces of local skepticism. By noon, we had sold every jar and were taking pre-orders for the next batch. We weren't just accepted in the community. We were becoming a point of local pride. That evening, riding the high of our successful market day, I received an unexpected call. My father's name on the caller ID nearly prompted me to let go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Ethan," he began, his voice lacking its usual crisp authority. I read the article, the one in Food and Wine. "Oh," I responded, not sure what else to say. "Your mother made me subscribe years ago," he continued awkwardly. "Never actually read it before, but someone at the firm mentioned seeing your name." The silence stretched between us, filled with years of expectations and disappointments on both sides. "I was wrong," he finally said, the words sounding like they'd been physically painful to produce. "About the bees, about you leaving the firm, all of it." I nearly dropped the phone. In 30 years, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard my father admit a mistake. "Sorry, son. You know what they say about old dogs and new tricks," he continued with a strained chuckle. "Though your grandfather always said I was too stubborn even for a dog." We talked for nearly an hour, the longest non-business conversation we'd had in years. He asked genuine questions about beekeeping, actually listened to my answers, and even expressed interest in visiting the farm. By the time we hung up, something had shifted between us. Not healed entirely, but at least acknowledged. The ultimate validation came 3 days later in the form of an email from Whole Earth Market, one of the largest national organic grocery chains. They were interested in featuring Mountain Elixir as part of their premium local foods initiative. The proposed contract included a 6-figure advance and nationwide distribution. It was everything a small business could dream of: financial security, mainstream recognition, and the resources to expand significantly. The bank loan would be paid off in one fell swoop, with plenty left over for property repairs and business investment. Lucy and I stayed up late discussing the opportunity, weighing the benefits against potential compromises. The contract would require standardizing our production methods, possibly relocating parts of the operation to their regional processing center, and committing to minimum production quantities that would stretch our current capacity. "What would your grandfather do?" Lucy asked as we sat on the porch, watching stars appear in the clear Vermont sky. "He'd say that success means nothing if you lose the soul of what you're doing," I replied after a moment's thought. But he was also practical. He took out that loan for a reason, probably to expand the specialty project. We tentatively decided to negotiate, hoping to find middle ground that would preserve the integrity of our product while securing our financial future. I emailed our conditions to the Whole Earth representative before turning in for the night. At first, I thought the strange buzzing sound was coming from my phone, perhaps an email notification about our counteroffer. But as I became more fully awake, I realized it was coming from outside. I slipped on boots and jacket and headed out to the apiary, flashlight in hand. What I saw stopped me cold. The bees, normally settled quietly in their hives at night, were swarming around the special hives, their behavior erratic and agitated. As I watched in horror, bees began pouring out of one hive, abandoning it entirely. The other special hives showed similar signs of distress, with unusual flight patterns and aggressive buzzing. Something was terribly wrong. In the dim flashlight beam, I noticed subtle disturbances around the hives, footprints that weren't mine or Lucy's, and strange residue near the hive entrances. This wasn't a natural occurrence. Someone had been here, tampering with our bees. As the full moon emerged from behind clouds, illuminating the chaos of our distressed apiary, the realization hit me. Our success had made us targets. And now, the heart of everything we built was literally fly away into the night. I spent the rest of that night monitoring the disturbed hives, calling Lucy in a panic. She arrived just before dawn with her father in tow, his decades of beekeeping experience suddenly invaluable. By sunrise, we'd managed to calm and contain most of the fleeing bees, though one colony had abandoned its hive entirely. Never seen behavior like this without a cause, Lucy's father muttered, examining residue near the hive entrance. Something spooked them. Bad. We spent the morning investigating, following bee flight patterns and checking the surrounding area. The trail led us to the neighboring property, 800 acres of formerly family-owned farmland that had recently been sold to AgriGrow, a subsidiary of one of those massive agricultural conglomerates with innocuous names and troubling practices. From the property line, we could see workers in hazmat suits spraying the newly plowed fields. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Lucy's face had gone pale. "They're using Neo X5," she said, recognizing the spraying equipment. "It's a new generation of neonicotinoid pesticide, technically approved for use, but the approval was rushed through regulatory channels. The preliminary research showed catastrophic effects on pollinators." Her father nodded grimly. "Kills bees on contact, and the ones that don't die immediately bring it back to the hive where it poisons the entire colony. Essentially a death sentence for any apiary within 3 miles. The revelation left me cold. In a matter of days, all our hard work could literally fly away or die. Our special bees, my grandfather's legacy and our livelihood, were facing extinction from corporate chemicals deployed with government approval. Our smallest friends had become victims of the largest greed. Lucy observed bitterly as we watched another spraying truck roll along the perimeter of the field. My first instinct was to file lawsuits, the corporate lawyer's son emerging with righteous fury. But Lucy's father quickly squashed that idea with rural pragmatism. Courts take years. Bees don't have years. And technically, they're operating within legal guidelines, even if those guidelines are bought and paid for. We needed a more immediate solution. The answer came that evening during an emergency meeting at Lucy's bookstore cafe, where we gathered friends and fellow beekeepers to brainstorm. Sheriff Jenkins, now our regular customer and unlikely ally, made an offhand comment that sparked inspiration. "Shame you can't just move all them bees somewhere safer," he said, dunking a cookie into his coffee. "Spread 'em out so one bad neighbor can't kill 'em all." That's exactly what we decided to do. The Bee Guardians initiative was born that night. Instead of fighting a losing legal battle against a corporate giant, we would distribute our bee colonies throughout the community, placing small satellite hives in backyards, gardens, and farms beyond the reach of AgriGrow's chemicals. The logistics were daunting. We needed to identify suitable locations, build dozens of smaller hives, and carefully relocate colonies without losing queens or causing dangerous swarms. We needed volunteers willing to host hives and learn basic monitoring. And we needed to do it all within days, before the next scheduled spraying could reach our precious special colonies. What happened next still humbles me when I think about it. Word spread through Millfield faster than gossip about the mayor's affair with the choir director, which, coincidentally, had broken the previous week. By noon the following day, we had over 50 volunteers offering their properties as bee sanctuaries. The high school woodshop teacher offered to lead an emergency hive building workshop. The local radio station ran hourly updates on Operation Bee Rescue, like it was breaking news. 3 days later, the entire town seemed to converge on my property for the Great Bee Migration. Pickup trucks formed a convoy stretching down my driveway. Children wore homemade bee costumes. Someone brought a barbecue grill and set up an impromptu picnic area. It felt more like a festival than an emergency ecological intervention. Walter Jenkins, a 92-year-old farmer whose family had worked the same land since before Vermont was a state, summed it up perfectly as he watched the careful loading of hive boxes. One bee makes a drop of honey, one hive makes a quart. But it takes a community to make something truly sweet, he observed, leaning on his walking stick. The simple wisdom of it brought unexpected tears to my eyes. By nightfall, our bees had 42 new homes scattered throughout a 15-mile radius, including 6 special nucleus colonies from our original hardy strain, each placed with experienced beekeepers who had sworn solemn oaths to follow our specific care instructions. The wholehearted community response made something else clear to me. The next morning, I declined the whole earth market offer. Their standardized production methods and centralized processing would have destroyed exactly what made our honey special, its connection to the specific place and community. Instead, Lucy and I drew up plans for what would become the Honeycomb Collective, a cooperative bringing together local beekeepers to preserve traditional methods and honey diversity. Each member would maintain their individual operations but share resources, equipment, and marketing under a unified brand that emphasized transparency and sustainability. The day I intended to propose to Lucy coincided with the first official meeting of the Honeycomb Collective. The late summer had blessed us with perfect weather, and the lavender field behind Lucy's father's house, now part of our cooperative network, provided the backdrop I'd been envisioning for weeks. I'd planned everything meticulously. After the meeting, I would suggest a walk to the lavender. At the field center, where her father had placed a bench years ago, I would kneel and present the ring I'd had made by a local jeweler, a honeycomb design with tiny amber stones. The meeting went smoothly. Our community distribution model had not only saved our bees, but increased production as the colonies thrived in diverse environments. The collective had already secured contract with restaurants throughout New England, and a waiting list for our special mountain elixir stretched months long. As planned, I suggested the walk afterward. Lucy, intuitive as always, seemed to sense something significant was coming. Her sidelong glances and slight smile told me she suspected my intentions. The purple-blue lavender stretched around us like an aromatic ocean as we reached the center of the field. I had just dropped to one knee, ring box in hand, when the air around us erupted in sound. A massive swarm of bees, one of our rescued special colonies, had chosen this exact moment to split and relocate. Thousands of bees swirled around us, creating a living, buzzing dome. Lucy froze, eyes wide. I remained on one knee, ring extended upward, surrounded by what looked like a bee tornado. Any normal person would have run screaming. Instead, Lucy began laughing, a full-bodied, joyous sound that somehow seemed to calm the swarm around us. "Don't stop now," she managed between fits of giggles. "This is perfectly us." So there, kneeling in lavender, encircled by thousands of bees that seemed to be performing their own approval dance, I continued. "Like these bees, I found my true home. Will you marry me?" Her yes was nearly drowned out by the humming of our tiny matchmakers, but I caught it. And the kiss that followed, witnessed by a few thousand of our closest insect friends, remains the sweetest memory of my life. 5 years have passed since that day. The Honeycomb Collective has grown beyond our wildest expectations, becoming a national model for organic beekeeping and sustainable agriculture. Our royal elixir, the perfected version of my grandfather's special recipe, is served in top restaurants across the country and has been featured in culinary magazines worldwide. The old Victorian house has been fully restored, its wraparound porch now hosting educational tours and workshops for aspiring beekeepers. My father, in a plot twist no one saw coming, retired from his law practice and now handles the collective's legal affairs, finding more satisfaction in protecting bees and corporate interests. Lucy and I split our time between the original farmhouse and a modern education center we built on the property, where research into bee preservation continues alongside public outreach programs. Our son, now 3 years old, has his own miniature bee suit and proudly calls himself the Prince of Bees. Watching him fearlessly approach the observation hives, talking to the bees like old friends, I see echoes of both my grandfather and the man I've become. Sometimes on summer evenings when the day's work is done, Lucy and I sit on that same porch where I once contemplated defeat, surrounded by the gentle hum of successful hives. We often reflect on my grandfather's wisdom that set this unlikely journey in motion. Little creatures can lead to great achievements, he wrote in his journal, but only if you're willing to listen to their buzzing instead of the noise of the crowd. In a world increasingly disconnected from natural rhythms and authentic experiences, we found success not by scaling up and standardizing, but by staying small, specific, and true to the unique qualities of our place and product, by connecting to community rather than chasing unlimited growth. The irony isn't lost on me that in leaving behind the pursuit of traditional success, I found something far more valuable: purpose, community, love, and yes, even financial security. Just not in the form I've been trained to expect. When visitors ask what's the secret to our special honey, I tell them the truth. It's the specific flowers, the unique bee strain, the careful handling. But privately, I know the real magic ingredient isn't the honey at all. It's in the choice to value what's authentic over what's expedient, what's meaningful over what's merely profitable. That's a lesson worth more than any investment portfolio or corner office. It just took thousands of tiny teachers and one stubborn old beekeeper's legacy to help me learn it.